The judge said nothing. He simply looked down at the sealed file and began to read. One page. Then he looked up. His eyes moved across the courtroom. Everyone in this courtroom, stand up. For one beat. No one moved. Margaret looked at me. The smile disappeared from her face. But before anyone in that courtroom rose to their feet, my mother-in-law had walked in believing that, before this day was over, she would be taking my daughter away from me. And when she saw me walk in without a lawyer beside me, she thought she'd already won. Margaret Morgan looked over my shoulder, once, then again. She was waiting for someone to walk in behind me. A lawyer, an assistant, anyone who could explain why the chair beside me was still empty. But no one came. I set my leather briefcase on the table. Margaret leaned toward David. She really came alone. David didn't smile. He just pulled the case file closer. Across the room, Thomas Reed noticed the empty chair too. He didn't say anything. He simply wrote something on the legal pad in front of him. When the case was called, Reed stood first. Thomas Reed, appearing on behalf of the petitioner. Your Honor. Then it was my turn. Claire Morgan. The judge looked down at the docket. Mrs. Morgan, I don't have counsel listed as appearing on your behalf. He looked up. You intend to represent yourself at today's hearing? Yes, Your Honor. He studied me for another second. You understand the rules concerning documents submitted this close to a hearing? I do. And if opposing counsel objects, the court would have to find good cause before considering them. The pen in Reed's hand stopped, just for a beat. Then he started writing again. Margaret said nothing. The judge turned to the petition in front of him, and that was when the stakes became impossible to ignore. Margaret wasn't asking for more time with Sophie. She was asking for temporary custody, effective today. If the judge granted her petition, my daughter could be taken out of my home before the sun went down. I glanced toward the row behind me. Sophie was sitting beside the family support advocate, 12 years old, both hands resting in her lap. Her right thumb slowly rubbing against the edge of her left thumbnail. It was almost nothing. Most people wouldn't have noticed, but I knew that habit. She only did it when she was trying not to let anyone see how scared she was. I turned back toward the table, before Sophie could catch me looking. Thomas Reed stood. Your Honor, my client does not make this request lightly. He placed a visitation calendar on the table. Overnight visits have stopped, then another stack. Emails. Several scheduled visits have been canceled. And finally, he picked up a single sheet of paper. And this is a message Mrs. Claire Morgan sent directly to my client. One copy went to the judge. Another was handed to me. I looked down. One sentence had been highlighted in yellow. After Sunday, you will not be seeing Sophie again. After Sunday, you will not be seeing Sophie again. Reed didn't explain it. He didn't have to. Standing alone, the sentence looked terrible. Margaret looked at me. I read it again, once, then one more time. I remembered writing those words. I remembered the day I sent them. I even remembered where I was standing when I typed them. And I remembered something else. Exactly what came after the highlighted sentence. But none of it was on the page in front of me. Reed looked directly at me. Mrs. Morgan, are you disputing the authenticity of that message? No. He paused. Maybe that wasn't the answer he expected. So you admit you wrote it? Yes. Then what exactly are you disputing? I lowered the page onto the table. Not its authenticity. Reed waited. I looked straight at him. Its completeness. For the first time since the hearing began, Reed stopped looking at me. His eyes dropped to the printout in his hand. This time, he stared at it a little longer. I didn't know who had prepared that screenshot. I didn't know who decided where it should begin, and I didn't know where the rest of the conversation had gone. But I knew one thing. Thomas Reed was holding an incomplete version of what had actually been said. And if he had never seen the rest of it, then this wasn't just a damaging text message anymore. It became a question. Who decided that this was exactly where the judge should stop reading. If you've ever watched someone get judged on only part of the truth, leave a comment below and remember this piece of paper, because the sealed file the judge would eventually open didn't begin with a lie, it began with things that were completely real, carefully selected to tell only half the story, and the other half hadn't made it into that courtroom yet. Margaret took the witness stand. Thomas Reed rose. "Mrs. Morgan, why are you asking the court to intervene on an emergency basis?" Margaret didn't look at me. She looked towards Sophie. "Because I'm afraid I'm losing my granddaughter." Reed let the answer sit for a beat. "What makes you believe that?" "After Ethan died, Claire changed. Margaret talked about the calls I didn't answer, the dinners I canceled, the weekends Sophie stopped spending the night at her house. Then she brought up one night in particular. Last November, the family held a memorial dinner for Ethan." Reed asked, "Did Claire attend?" "No." "Sophie?" "No." "How much notice were you given?" Margaret looked at me. "A few hours." I didn't object, because that part was true. I had canceled that dinner, and that day. I hadn't told her why. Reed moved on. "Has Claire ever talked about leaving Virginia?" "Yes." "What did she say?" "That she and Sophie needed a fresh start." I remembered saying that, because I had. There was no school transfer paperwork, no house listed for sale, no job waiting for me in another state. But Reed hadn't asked about any of that. Not yet. He picked up the screenshot from earlier in the hearing. "After Sunday, you will not be seeing Sophie again. How did you understand this message?" Margaret answered immediately. "Claire wanted to cut us out of Sophie's life." She looked toward her granddaughter. "I already lost my son." Her voice dropped. And I started to feel like I was losing my granddaughter too. Behind her, David looked at his mother, then down at the file in front of him. He didn't nod. No further questions. The judge looked at me. "Mrs. Morgan?" I stood. "Thank you, Your Honor." I didn't start by calling Margaret a liar. I started with a number. "In the last 12 months, how many times have you asked to see Sophie?" Margaret shook her head. "I don't remember exactly." 14. I placed the visitation calendar on the table. I agreed 8 times. I turned the page. 3 times. "You canceled?" "Yes." "Once because Sophie had the flu?" "Yes." "Once because she had a school competition?" "Yes." I paused. "And once I canceled." Margaret looked at me. "Ethan's memorial dinner." "Yes." "And you didn't explain why?" "No." I held her gaze. "I should have." Margaret said nothing. I didn't need to win that point. She was right. I turned back to the calendar. "But other than that one occasion, can you show the court a single message from the past 12 months where I told you that you could no longer see Sophie?" Margaret looked toward Reed. "There's the Sunday message." "I know." I looked at the screenshot sitting on his table. "We'll come back to that." I closed the calendar. "There's something else you were right about." Margaret looked at me. "I stopped Sophie from spending the night at your house." "Yes. But before you tell the court that was a decision I made on my own." I opened the leather briefcase and took out a single sheet of paper. Not a text message, not a visitation calendar. I placed it in front of Margaret. She looked down. I watched her eyes stop at the top of the page. "Do you recognize this document?" Margaret didn't answer right away. I waited, finally. "Yes." "You received a copy of it?" Another pause. "Yes." I looked at the judge, then back at Margaret. "And you received it before Sophie's overnight visits at your house stopped?" Margaret looked down at the document again. This time, her voice was quieter. "Yes." "Yes." Margaret confirmed that she had received the document before Sophie's overnight visits at her house were stopped. I handed one copy to Thomas Reed. Another was passed to the judge. Reed read the top of the page, then looked up at Margaret. "This is a written recommendation from Sophie's counselor?" "Yes." "And both you and I received a copy?" "Yes." I pointed to the paragraph in the middle of the page. "This recommendation was made after Sophie began having emotional difficulties?" Margaret nodded. "Yes." "What did the counselor recommend?" Margaret hesitated for a few seconds. That the overnight visits be paused. At your house? Yes. Was that a decision I made on my own? No. I moved to the next line. Did the recommendation say Sophie should stop seeing you altogether? No. Daytime visits could continue? Yes. And they did continue? Margaret looked at me. Yes. I stopped there. I didn't bring up Ethan's memorial dinner again. I didn't try to make every decision I'd ever made sound like the right one. I only needed to clarify what was actually before the court. I had stopped Sophie's overnight visits at Margaret's house, but the restriction hadn't come from me. Thomas Reed stood. Mrs. Morgan, I have a few questions. He picked up the counselor's recommendation. This document only explains why the overnight visits stopped? Yes. It doesn't explain why Claire canceled Ethan's memorial dinner? No. And it doesn't say that Claire was emotionally stable at all times in the period after her husband's death? No. Reed set the document down. I looked at him. It was a fair point. I had shown that one part of Margaret's story was missing context. That didn't mean everything else she had said was false. Reed returned to his table. Your Honor, I'd like to introduce another piece of evidence. He opened an audio file. The file name appeared on the screen, and I recognized it immediately. A phone call between David and me, 8 months after Ethan died. I looked at David. He was staring at the screen too. Reed turned toward me. Mrs. Morgan, please listen to this. The recording began. David's voice came first, then mine. Hoarse, exhausted, slower than I remembered. Sometimes I think Sophie would be better off somewhere else for a while. There was the sound of a breath. Then the recording stopped. I looked at the duration on the screen. 0:17. 17 seconds. Thomas Reed turned toward me. Is that your voice? Yes. And you said those words? Yes. So, during the same period, Mrs. Morgan says she became concerned about Sophie. You yourself believed your daughter might be better off somewhere else? Before I could answer, a small movement behind me made me turn. Sophie had stopped picking at her thumbnail. She wasn't looking at Margaret. She wasn't looking at Reed. She was looking at me. The judge checked the time. We'll take a 15-minute recess. Chairs shifted. Papers were gathered. People began to stand. I stayed where I was. I had been prepared to answer Reed. I had dates, documents, the rest of the conversations. But Sophie didn't need any of those things. She had just heard her own mother's voice say that, at one point, she might be better off somewhere else. And when Sophie stood up, I knew the hardest question I would face that morning wasn't going to come from Thomas Reed. It was going to come from my daughter. The 15-minute recess began. Sophie stood before I did. She walked into the hallway and stopped beside a window at the far end. I followed her. I didn't call her name. I didn't try to explain anything before she was ready to hear it. Sophie stared through the glass for a long moment, then turned to me. Did you really mean that? I knew exactly which words she meant. Sophie would be better off somewhere else for a while. I could have told her the recording was only 17 seconds long. I could have told her she hadn't heard the rest of the conversation. I could have told her Margaret had taken my words out of context. But Sophie wasn't asking about Margaret. She was asking about me. Yes. She looked straight at me. There was a time when I did think that. Why? I took a breath. 8 months after your dad died, I was barely sleeping. Some mornings I'd drop you off at school. Then sit in the car for a long time because I couldn't make myself go home. Sophie looked down. I remember. That night, I called Uncle David. Why? Because I needed help. I looked at her. I was scared that if I kept going the way I was going, you'd have to live through everything I was going through too. And I didn't want that for you. Sophie said nothing. Uncle David gave me the number of a counselor. I asked if you could stay with your grandmother for one night so I could go talk to someone. Sophie looked up. Then why didn't you tell me? That question stopped me. Not because I didn't have an answer, because the answer didn't sound as right as it once had. Because I thought protecting you meant not letting you see me fall apart. Sophie held my gaze. I still saw it. I had nothing to say to that. Neither did she. I rested my hand on the windowsill beside hers. I didn't hug her. I didn't pull her toward me. We just stood there. A few seconds later, the family support advocate approached us. Sophie, I need you to come back to the waiting area for a little while. Sophie nodded. Before she left, she looked at me one more time. Then she walked away. At the other end of the hallway, Thomas Reed was standing with David. David had his phone in his hand. As I approached, Reed asked him, "You were the other person on the call we just heard?" "Yes." "And you still have the original recording?" "I do." David opened the file. Reed looked at the screen. 1:53. His brow tightened. "The recording my office received was 17 seconds. David looked at him. "That's not what I sent." "Who did you send the file to?" "My mother." "This file?" "Yes." "The full 1 minute and 53 seconds. All of it." Reed glanced toward Margaret. She was standing near the courtroom doors. Then he turned back to David. "When you heard Claire that night, did you believe she wanted to give Sophie up?" David didn't answer immediately. He looked at me, then shook his head. "No. I thought she was exhausted." He looked down at his phone. "She called me because she knew she needed help." Reed was quiet for a few seconds. Then he walked toward Margaret. "Mrs. Morgan." Margaret turned. "Do you still have the file David sent you?" "Yes." "The one that's almost 2 minutes long?" Margaret looked at David. Then at Reed. "Yes." Reed held up the 17-second recording from his case file. "My office never received that file." Margaret said nothing. Reed didn't accuse her of anything. He simply said, "Before we go back into that courtroom, I need the original." David had sent. 1 minute and 53 seconds. Thomas Reed had received 17 seconds. And this time, when the courtroom doors opened, Reed wasn't walking back in with the same recording he'd walked out with. When the hearing resumed, Thomas Reed stood before the judge, called the next witness. "Your Honor, I need to correct a piece of evidence that was presented before the recess." The judge looked at him. "Which evidence?" "The recording of the phone call between Claire Morgan and David Morgan." Reed placed 2 devices in front of him. "The version my office received was 17 seconds long. The original recording is 1 minute and 53 seconds. The judge was silent for a moment. "You verified the longer recording?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Play the entire thing." David's voice came first, then mine. The same sentence Sophie had heard before the recess played again. "Sometimes I think Sophie would be better off somewhere else for a while." But this time, the recording didn't stop. David asked, "Claire, have you gotten any sleep?" There was a pause before I answered. "Not much. Yesterday, Sophie asked why I keep sitting in the car in the driveway." David's voice came back. "What's going on?" "I don't want her to start taking care of me instead of the other way around." I heard myself take a breath. "Is that counselor you told me about still taking appointments?" "Yes. If your mom can keep Sophie Friday night, I'll go see them." David answered, "Okay, I'll call." The recording continued for a few more seconds. Then it ended. Nothing in the rest of that call erased the first 17 seconds. I had said those words. There had been a moment when I believed Sophie might be better off somewhere else for a little while. But now the courtroom had heard what came after them. I wasn't preparing to leave my daughter. I was trying to recognize my own limits before Sophie was forced to carry them for me. I turned around. Sophie was sitting in the row behind me, her hands still resting in her lap, but her thumb had stopped moving. David was called to the witness stand. Thomas Reed went straight to the point. "This is the original recording from your phone?" "Yes." "Who did you send it to?" "My mother." "Did you edit the recording before sending it?" "No." "Did you ever send a separate 17-second version?" "No." Reed looked at him. "When you heard Claire that night, did you believe she was trying to give Sophie up?" "No." "What did you think was happening?" David looked at me for a moment. "Claire was exhausted, and she knew she needed help." Reed gave a slight nod. No further questions. I stood. "David, The recording you sent Margaret was 1 minute and 53 seconds long? Yes. And that was the only version you sent? Yes. Thank you. I sat back down. There was no need to ask who had sat at a computer and cut the recording. No need to know what software had been used or exactly how it had been done. The chain was already clear. David sent Margaret the full recording. Margaret had the full recording. Thomas Reed received 17 seconds. If you believe someone shouldn't be judged by 17 seconds pulled out of an entire conversation, leave a like on this video. Thomas Reed returned to his table, but he didn't reach for his next exhibit. Instead, he reopened the evidence Margaret had given him and flipped back through the first few pages. Then he stopped. The screenshot was still there. After Sunday, you will not be seeing Sophie again. Reed read it. Then he looked at me. Mrs. Morgan. I stood. Yes? He held up the page. Do you have the complete conversation this came from? Yes. And you knew from the beginning that this version was incomplete? I did. Reed studied me for another second. How did you recognize that so quickly? I looked at the screenshot in his hand. Because I've worked with this kind of evidence before. Reed tilted his head slightly. Where? I answered. In the military. In the military. Thomas Reed kept looking at me. What did you do? I served in the Army's legal branch. JAG? Yes. Reed looked back at the screenshot in his hand. Administrative work? For a while. And after that? Trial work. He paused. You prosecuted cases? Yes. For how long? About 12 years. Across several assignments. Reed lowered the screenshot. Your last position? Senior trial counsel. He didn't ask about my rank. He didn't ask about medals. What interested him was already sitting on the table. He pointed to the screenshot. Did that work regularly involve digital evidence? Yes. Text messages? Yes. Audio recordings? Yes. And if only part of a conversation appeared in the evidence? I looked for the rest. Reed watched me. Is that how you knew this screenshot was incomplete? No. I looked at the highlighted sentence. I recognized this one because I wrote it. I opened the leather briefcase. But that experience is why I kept the full conversation. I took out a set of printed pages, and why I brought it with me today. One copy went to Reed. Another was passed to the judge. At the top of the page was the same sentence everyone had already seen. After Sunday, you will not be seeing Sophie again. I pointed to the next line. The part that hadn't appeared in the screenshot. For overnight visits, until Sophie's counselor says she's ready. And immediately after that, daytime visits are fine. I'm not trying to keep her from you. Reed read the entire exchange, then he turned toward Margaret. You received this full message? Margaret looked down. Yes. You knew daytime visits were still allowed? Yes. And you knew the restriction applied only to overnight visits? Yes. Reed placed the screenshot beside the complete conversation. The judge studied both pages, then looked toward the corrected audio evidence from earlier. Mr. Reed. Yes, Your Honor. The 17-second recording and this screenshot were both provided to your office by the same source? Reed was silent for a beat. He looked at Margaret. Yes. The judge turned to me. Mrs. Morgan, why did Sophie's counselor recommend stopping the overnight visits? Because Sophie had begun showing signs of anxiety after conversations about who she should be living with. Margaret looked up. I never told Sophie she had to leave her mother. I looked at her. I didn't say you did. I took out another document. But this is the recommendation you received. A copy was passed to the judge. I pointed to the paragraph in the middle. The adults were instructed not to discuss with Sophie who she should choose to live with. I turned toward Margaret. You received this recommendation? Yes. Before you filed for custody? Yes. I set the document down and reached for another page. And afterward, you sent this message to David. Thomas Reed took the copy. He didn't read the message first. He looked at the date, then at the date on the counselor's recommendation. Only then did he read the words. If Sophie understood that she has a choice, she would choose us. If Sophie understood that she had a choice, she would choose us. Reed placed the two documents side by side. He said nothing. The judge looked at the dates too. The recommendation came first. The message came after. I turned toward Margaret. You wrote this? Margaret looked at the document, then at David, but not at Sophie. I waited. Finally, she answered. Yes. I didn't ask why. Not yet. I simply pulled the counselor's recommendation closer and placed it beside the message. Then I left them there. Yes. Margaret admitted she had written the message. I didn't move to my next question right away. I placed the two documents side by side. On the left, the counselor's recommendation. On the right, the message Margaret had sent David. I pointed to the first document. You received this recommendation before you sent that message to David? Yes. And it instructed the adults not to discuss with Sophie who she should choose to live with? Margaret looked down. Yes. I moved my finger to the document beside it. And after receiving that recommendation, you wrote, if Sophie understood that she has a choice, she would choose us. Margaret looked up. I just wanted Sophie to know she had a voice. She's 12. I'm her grandmother. I know. I went back to the first document. But when you wrote that message, you already knew the counselor had asked the adults not to put that choice on Sophie? A beat passed. Yes. I took the custody petition from my briefcase and placed it beside the other two documents. 3 pages now sat in front of us. Now I want to ask you about the day you signed this petition. Margaret looked down. As of that day, had any counselor concluded that Sophie was unsafe living with me? No. Any doctor? No. Any report from her school saying Sophie was being neglected? No. I turned to the next section. Did you have any financial records showing that I had misused money intended for Sophie? No. Thomas Reed remained seated at his table. He didn't object. I looked back at Margaret. So when you signed this petition, you had no professional finding that Sophie was unsafe in my home? Margaret clasped her hands tighter. No. I placed my finger on the words at the top of the page. Emergency temporary custody. Then what was the emergency? This time, Margaret took longer to answer. I thought you were going to take Sophie away. Out of Virginia? Yes. By the day you filed this petition, had I submitted paperwork to transfer Sophie to another school? No. Had I listed my house for sale? No. Had I accepted a job in another state? No. Then what were you basing that belief on? You said you and Sophie needed a fresh start. Yes. I didn't avoid it. I did say that. Then I took out one final page. You also told David that I wouldn't fight this petition? Margaret looked at the page. I don't remember. I handed it to her. She read it. Yes. Why did you think I wouldn't fight it? Margaret looked at me for a long moment. Because you always back away. I said nothing. After Ethan died, you barely spoke to us anymore. Whenever things got difficult, you shut the door. Her voice wasn't as sharp now. You didn't argue. You didn't explain. She glanced toward Sophie, then back at me. I thought you'd give in this time too. I knew that part wasn't entirely wrong. There were things I had allowed silence to answer for me. But I didn't need to explain them here. I only had one more question. But I didn't give in? Margaret looked at me. No. I nodded. No further questions. I returned to my table. There was no speech, no declaration of victory, just 3 documents sitting in front of the judge. A recommendation Margaret had received, a message she sent afterward, and an emergency custody petition signed without a single professional finding that Sophie was unsafe in my care. The judge studied them for a moment. Then he looked up. We'll move to closing arguments. Thomas Reed stood first. He didn't bring up the 17-second recording again. He didn't try to defend the screenshot or deny what the full record had revealed. Your Honor, my client lost her son. Reed looked toward Margaret. She loves Sophie, and I believe much of what she has done came from the fear of losing another member of her family. He paused. But today's record also shows that some of the evidence presented to this court did not include its full context. Reed sat down. Then it was my turn. I stood. I don't doubt that Margaret loves Sophie, and I won't deny that after Ethan died, I did a terrible job communicating with this family. I withdrew. There were times when I let silence speak for me, when I should have explained myself. I looked at Sophie, then back at the judge. But that isn't the question before this court today. I rested my hand on the case file. There is no evidence that Sophie is unsafe in my home. No professional has recommended removing her from my care. And no emergency has been established. I paused. I'm asking the court to deny the petition. Then I sat down. The judge reviewed the documents in front of him. The counselor's recommendation, the complete text exchange, the full 1 minute and 53-second recording. Finally, he looked up. The court does not find sufficient grounds for an emergency transfer of custody of Sophie Morgan. The petition is denied. I didn't look at Margaret. I didn't look at Reed. The judge continued. There is no credible evidence before this court that Sophie is currently unsafe in her mother's care. The court is also concerned that certain evidence was presented without necessary context. Margaret lowered her eyes. Contact between Sophie and her grandmother may continue in accordance with the counselor's recommendations, but no adult is to place Sophie in the position of choosing who she wants to live with. He closed the file. This hearing is concluded. I turned around. Sophie was still sitting in the row behind me, both hands resting in her lap. This time, they were still. We were waiting for the elevator when Margaret called my name. Claire. I turned. She stood a few steps away from me. No Thomas Reed beside her. No case file in her hands. Margaret looked at Sophie, then at me. I lost Ethan. Her voice dropped. I thought if I lost Sophie too, I'd lose whatever I had left of him. I understood what she meant, but that was exactly what had to change. Sophie isn't what's left of Ethan. Margaret looked at me. She's Sophie. Margaret didn't answer right away. Finally, she asked, "You're not going to stop me from seeing her?" No. I held her gaze. But the overnight visits don't start again until the counselor says Sophie is ready. Margaret nodded. And no one asks her who she wants to live with again. Okay. One word. Not an apology. Not forgiveness either. But the boundary was clear. Sophie stepped beside me and looked at Margaret. I have a choir performance next Thursday. Margaret hesitated. What time? 7. I'll be there. Sophie nodded. There was no hug. No promise that everything would go back to the way it was. Just a choir performance next Thursday. And for now, that was enough. The elevator doors opened, and Sophie stepped inside with me. Just before they closed, she reached over and took my hand. That morning, Margaret had looked at the empty chair beside me and thought I had come to court alone. I looked down at Sophie's hand holding mine, then watched the doors close. That empty chair had never been the thing that mattered. If you enjoy stories where the truth is revealed one layer at a time, subscribe and come back for the next story.